Hello and welcome to a rather different video. Today I'm in Dickens, London, and I'm going to show you what Pip's landscape looked like. So here I am in Temple, and I'm just going to scan around so you can see the kind of environment that he lived in. Now let's come lower so you can get the skyline. You can see the sort of grand buildings we've got here, and I'm now scanning round past the church to show you the law courts. So here are the courts of justice. So there are the courts of justice. You can see how grand they are, and now we can see why this place is called the Temple. It is a temple of justice, a temple of the law. Okay, so that's Temple just behind me, and I've come into Essex Street, and I'll just circle round so you can see the kind of buildings that we're looking at. This is the sort of building that Pip would have lived in Essex Street, just off Temple. Now the name Essex is important here because Essex is where Pip tries to escape to when he's trying to get Magwitch away on the Thames. They go to Gravesend. I'll talk about that a bit later. But let's just have a look at the kind of street that he's chosen to live in. Something incredibly well-to-do, very expensive. So what's the attraction of this area of London? It's a bit bizarre, isn't it? Well, the attraction is Essex itself, that image of escape, but it's also its proximity to the Thames, the means of escape. I'll take you to the Thames in a minute. And finally, it's at the very centre of British law. And at this stage, Pip has all his faith in British law and all his faith in Jaggers. We'll explore why that faith might be misplaced later. Okay, I'm now at the far end of Essex Street, and behind me, the buildings you can see are all called chambers. They're all still populated by lawyers. Now, the Temple here is obviously a religious symbol, and for Pip, his religion is the law. And interestingly, Dickens has Pip entirely safe while he's in the Temple. So hopefully you'll remember that Orlick hides out on his stairs and could easily kill him in the dark, but is unable even to speak to Pip. He's so scared of him. He can only attack Pip when they're back on home turf, because the Temple is his protection. And Dickens does this to try to suggest that the law should be everyone's protection. We are all protected by our rights, which are enforced in law. And when we think about Magwitch and Jaggers, Dickens is attacking what the law has become, but here showing us what it could be. Okay, behind me you can see the gateway from the river into Temple. And a gate's significant, isn't it? It's suggestive of protection. You put gates when you want to keep the enemy out, and this is where Pip hides himself, away from the enemy that is Magwitch, the convicts. And interestingly, it's Magwitch, the enemy of the law, who finds him there and becomes, through Dickens, the friend of the law, which I'll explain in a moment. Okay, behind me, where I've just come from, the gate, I'm now in a park. Now this is the kind of park that Pip would have walked in when he's rescued by Joe, when he's ill at the end. He's brought back to life by Joe, if you like, but symbolically, he's also brought back to life by the park. And if we scan round here, you'll see that the park is right next door to the river. So again, it's a symbol of escape. So being well and feeling good is a symbol of escaping from London society, from British society. And it's the river just over there, or over there, that's going to take Pip away from Britain. And that's when he'll finally become himself, a man away from the class system in Cairo. Okay, next stop, the River Thames. Here it is right behind me, and this is just across from Temple. Let me just scan around. So right behind me are the buildings of Temple, which I showed you earlier. That's where Pip lived, and he's chosen this spot, being really close to the river. Now let's have a look at how he gets his boat onto the river. So if I scan around, just behind me, look, there you can see the steps that go down onto the river. They're blocked off to the public now, But this is how Pip would have prepared himself for escape, rowing and rowing with his friends, Startop and Herbert. Now behind me you can also see one of the few ships that's currently on the Thames, and this is a steamer. It's different to the ones that Dickens is writing about, which would have had the paddles on them, but you can see why Pip wouldn't risk getting on a steamer in London here. Instead, he would get on the river and head that way out towards Gravesend. Now hopefully you've thought about the symbolism of Gravesend. The novel starts in a graveyard, Pip with Magwitch on a gravestone, and Pip's dreams of escape with Magwitch are towards this place in Essex. Remember, that's the street that I just showed you. So he's off to Gravesend in Essex, and this is where Compeyson dies, but Magwitch's attempt to be finally free also dies. This is Gravesend for Magwitch, and it is also Gravesend for Pip's desire to be a gentleman. But is this a tragedy, or is it a triumph because Pip escapes the class system and becomes his own man abroad? So for Pip, perhaps it isn't a tragedy, but Dickens' wider point is that it is a tragedy for British society, because the rest of us, in Dickens' time that is, the rest of us are still trapped in this class system, unable to be truly ourselves, obsessed with the hierarchy of class, and doomed to a life of misery and injustice, which Dickens wants to change. So behind me is the only surviving gateway left into London. This is called the Temple Bar. So Dickens had this very much in mind because Jaggers World exists through that. Now let me just rotate. What's on the other side but St. Paul's? Check it out again, this massive hole in the centre of the novel that Jaggers skirts around because he is not a Christian character and because the society that he creates is unequal. Right, I'm now going to tell you about the big black hole at the centre of Jaggers World. So watch this. Behind me is the massive dome of St. Paul's. We'll have to get closer for you to see the massive scale of it. But as I rotate round, this is the river going towards Essex that Pip travels on. Just some scooters going by there. You can see the skyscrapers behind me, even in the mist. Canary Wharf is that way. And if I come round, you'll see more skyscrapers behind me. But in Dickens' time, none of that was here. What was here was this immense, majestic masterpiece, St. Pauls Cathedral. And it's a cathedral dedicated to God. Right at the centre of the landscape of Great Expectation is a big God-shaped space. And guess what? Nobody goes there. Nobody visits it. And Jaggers, as I'll show you, does a circle around this God-shaped space to symbolise how ungodly he is, and for Dickens, how ungodly the law has become. It's simply not just. And if we want to take another leap of interpretation there, he's also saying that London society is not just. The class system is not just. And that's why he creates Magwitch, and that's why he creates Compeyson. I didn't realise it at the time, but this is Bartholomew Street, where Jaggers has his office. And the building behind me is actually a church, which you won't be surprised to know Dickens refuses to mention because he wants to convey Jaggers' ungodliness. Well, here we are in another Dickensian part of London. This is just around Little Britain, and I just wanted to show you the kind of landscape and also how narrow the streets are. Let me just turn this around and you'll see how easy it is to imagine a kind of corrupt environment that Jaggers thrived in. And when Wemmick tells Pip about Jaggers knowing all the criminals in London, you can see the kind of alleyways that are just around his place of work, and this would have been full of London's criminal life. Dickens does that on purpose to suggest that Jaggers doesn't just defend these people, he's actually like them, only richer, and he's got the law on his side so he gets away with stuff. but really he's just as corrupt as the environment he works in. Right, well, just down there's the alley that I've just come from, which I showed you was typical of where Jaggers works. It might even be the exact place, because look, in the novel, Pip comes out, turns a corner and gets to Smithfield, and there it is, Smithfield. I'm going to take you in there and show you why Dickens deliberately takes Pip there in his first encounter with London, because it's symbolic about what London society is really like. So just as in Dickens' time, the market is now closed, but let's just check out this iron monstrosity. There's the roof. I'm going to pan around for you so you can see quite how big this is. It's closed, as I said. When we pan round, you'll see this is a mecca of slaughter. Everything here was dead and bleeding. Hopefully you get a sense here of how deep the market is, and that's just going one way. If I turn round, you'll see that it's equally large the other end. And you can imagine in Dickens' time, this is absolutely full of blood gushing into the gutters here, and it's a metaphor for what London is like. Corrupt, filthy and dangerous. Okay, we're through to the other side of the market now. There it is, that's one end of it. Let's pan round and see the other. Again, you can see how massive it is. But now I'm going to walk you into one of the best preserved Dickensian streets that's left in London. Let's see what it was really like. Okay, so here we are in Peter's Lane. Those are the kind of buildings we're looking at. That's how narrow the alleys are, just off Smithfield Market. Look at the building behind me with its skulls as a reminder of death. Remember, this is a book that starts in the graveyard, and this is where Magwitch meets his fate on his way to Gravesend in the Thames. This is a book obsessed with the good death. Right, here I am, just the other side of Smithfields. I'm standing in this alley, and let's just have a look at what's above me. You can see how oppressive it is. And now as I turn around, notice what the sign is behind me. Look, it's a solicitor's office. The law is still going on here in this corrupt setting. How cool is that? You know, history repeats itself. Let me just pan around again, and you can see just how claustrophobic and intimidating this London is. And this is the London in which Jaggers thrives, because he is the master of corruption. And no solicitors were hurt in this film. I'm sure this is a very reputable firm, okay? It is the 21st century, but you know what I mean. So here I am on my Google Maps tour trying to get to Newgate, the site of Newgate. Here's the kind of Victorian building I'm up against. And I'm in a place called Fetter Lane. And if I turn round, hopefully you'll see the street sign above me, which is New Fetter Lane. So what you've got here is a real history of prison life still in the landscape. Even the roads are still named after this appalling jail, the jail that Dickens wants to take us to, because it relives the history of his father, and it also plays into his great social message that we have to have prison justice and criminal reform. Okay, I've just taken a little side street off Fleet Street, and take a look at the building behind me. This is an old church that would have been here in Dickens' time, and we can see how prescient he is, because when I turn the camera, you're going to see where I'm going to walk next. I'm going to walk out of here right past the solicitor's office, which is right over my shoulder there. The church has turned into a solicitor's office, the very theme at the heart of Jaggers, how moral corruption has changed from a religious society into a secular one that values money, that values social class above goodness, above charity to the poor, and above reforming the criminal system so that poor people like Magwitch have a chance which Dickens gives him in Australia. Only out of Britain can Magwitch get a fair chance and become the man he was always destined to be. And the measure of his great success shows us how powerfully Dickens objects to British society, because in British society he becomes a criminal and he becomes a murderer and is executed. Whereas the true Magwitch is somebody who is a brilliant entrepreneur, a fantastic businessman, somebody who starts from nothing and works himself up to greatness without being immoral. Yet in Australia, everything he earns is legitimate. And this is Dickens' way of saying, look, if we changed our society and made it more like God intended, if you like, more just, where people treated each other with charity instead of the moral corruption of class and wealth and power that Jaggers represents, then we would be a fairer society. And that's why he skirts around St Paul's with that big godlike hole in the middle, and why here in Fleet Street it's still happening now, the church replaced by the law. So here I am, literally round the corner from St Paul's, and I'm at Amen Court, and this is what my search of the internet tells me. Through there is the last remaining piece of Newgate Wall. Now imagine that. I'm going to put this on time lapse so you can see me walk from here. I'm going that way though, to St Paul's, and you see how close we are to this symbol of Christianity, and cheek by jowl with that is this symbol of a penal system which penalises the poor, which is Newgate Jail. So here is my time-lapsed walk straight to St Paul's. You can see how close it is. Okay, here we are at the front entrance to St Paul's. Let's just scan up there to see how impressive it is, dominating the skyline. And as I pan round, guess what street we're going towards? It's Fleet Street. Fleet Street, on which the Old Bailey is now, on which Dickens began his early life as a crime reporter, and on which Newgate Jail sat next to St Paul's, a symbol of corruption. Okay, here we are in the tourist area of London. Can you guess where I am? Yep, you can tell from that behind me that it's Chinatown. Let me just give you the other view. Very recognisable to any of you who are lucky enough to travel abroad. We're in Chinatown, but that's not why we're here. We're here because this is where Jaggers lived. And so behind me are the kinds of properties that he would have lived in. There you go. We're going to have a look at some of these, but ask yourself this: why does an area become an immigrant area? Well, obviously it's because it's crowded, it's because there are jobs, and it's because it's an area socially on the way down. So once a proud social area full of rich people and the well-to-do, and then suddenly it falls from favour. And Leicester Square, which we'll go to in a minute, was considered in the late 1800s one of London's least reputable squares. Jaggers is living there earlier, in the early 1800s, although I will sneak around a minute and make a video for my Jekyll and Hyde readers, because hey, you might as well get two bangs for your buck. Anyway, see you soon. So this is the kind of large house that Jaggers would have lived in. This is lived in by the poet John Dryden, born 1631 and died 1700. So 100 years before Jaggers, and you can get a sense of how the place was declining by Dickens' time. Although remember, he's setting it much earlier than his own lifetime. He's setting it about 40 years before. Okay, now a similar house almost next door, and this one belonged to Paul de l'Emery, and he was the King's silversmith here till 1751. So as we move west along this Gerrard Street, you can see the decline in fortunes of the road. Next door again, the house of Edmund Burke, author and statesman, died 1797, and that's around the time that Pip is 7 years old, at the beginning of the novel. Okay, so this is Gerrard Street, and we can see what Dickens is doing here. He's signposting that Jaggers lives at the heart of what represents Britain, and so he doesn't just represent the law, he doesn't just represent his own corruption. He represents the corruption of his own society, which goes right to the top. So this is 1750 Leicester Square. This is the street directly behind Gerrard Street. Okay, so 50 years before Jaggers buys his house, presumably, or 40 years before he buys it. This is the respectability and wealth that Leicester Square offered right next door to Gerrard Street. But now, 50 odd years later and 60 years later, when Jaggers has moved in, it's now in decline. And we can see what Dickens would expect Londoners to know. Jaggers lives in a part of the city that was once known for its greatness and has now become rather louche, a little bit backward. It's not an area on the up, it's in the decline, just like Britain. And this is why Pitt longs to escape and ends up going to Cairo. It's the symbol of how Britain is no longer a country in which individuals can flourish on their own merit. And why? It's because it's not a society which is now morally just. Instead, it's controlled by people like Jaggers, who are corrupt and use the power of the law to keep that corruption away from punishment. Hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe.